Picture the scene. We're traveling back in time to a moment of pure, awe-inspiring historical weight. The stroke of midnight, right between the 14th and 15th of August, 1947. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the untold story of the night a nation was born. We're going to dive into the historical records, the facts, and the figures to figure out exactly how the map of South Asia was redrawn and why the events of this single night still resonate so deeply today.
Because at that exact stroke of midnight, something happened that had quite literally never happened before in world history. A massive, sprawling empire quietly lowered its flag, and in its place, two entirely new nations rose up almost simultaneously. They were born out of the exact same land and the exact same struggle for independence, yet they were destined to walk very different paths. One became Pakistan, and the other became India.
Now, to really grasp the staggering scale of this moment, consider this number, 400 million. The British Empire had ruled over a population of 400 million people on the subcontinent for nearly 200 years before this night. To understand the sheer magnitude of dividing a population that massive, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit.
Section 1. A growing political demand and the roots of separation. To really understand how this happened, we have to look at the demographics.
There were close to 100 million Muslims living in British India at the time. And as the decades went on, some pretty deep systemic concerns began to grow within this massive population. They started harboring serious anxieties about what their future was going to look like in a newly independent, unified country where they'd be a permanent political minority. They worried about how they'd be able to govern themselves according to their own faith, their culture, and their way of life. This whole ideological evolution was perfectly captured by the movement's most powerful voice, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, Jinnah was this brilliant lawyer, and early in his career, he was actually known as a strong advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity. But over the years, as the political climate changed, his perspective shifted dramatically. He became completely convinced that true justice for the Muslim minority could only happen through a totally separate state. And this shift, it became the bedrock of what's known as the two-nation theory. Jinnah's stance was absolutely uncompromising. He argued that Muslims and Hindus were, quote, two distinct nations with different customs, different religions, and different social and cultural traditions. He was articulating this bold vision that this 100 million strong population wasn't just a minority community, but an entirely separate nation that deserved its own sovereign homeland. So that brings us to Section 2, the Lahore Resolution and moving toward independence. Fast forward to March of 1940, and the energy on the ground had completely transformed. What started as growing concerns was now crystallizing into a formal, unstoppable demand. At a historic gathering in Lahore, the All India Muslim League formally passed a resolution calling for independent states for Muslims in the northwestern and eastern zones of British India. And man, this single demand spread like wildfire. It united millions of ordinary people, farmers, teachers, students, laborers, all behind one unified dream, a homeland of their own. They called this proposed homeland Pakistan, which translates to the land of the pure. Let's quickly trace how incredibly fast this moved. Following the collapse of the East India Company's rule back in 1857, the British Crown took direct control. Decades later, with the passing of that Lahore Resolution in 1940, the momentum became undeniable. But those years immediately following 1940 were intensely fraught. We're talking mass demonstrations, massive political tension, and tragically, deadly communal violence between Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities. By 1947, the British government, which was utterly exhausted by the financial and political costs of the Second World War, realized they just couldn't contain the escalating situation anymore. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was basically forced to rapidly accelerate the timeline for a British exit. Which leads us right into Section 3, the cost of partition and drawing the Radcliffe Line. While these high-level political agreements were being signed in grand rooms, the human reality on the ground was about to become an unprecedented tragedy. The monumental task of drawing the actual borders between these two new nations was handed to a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe. And here's a truly startling historical fact for you. Radcliffe had never even set foot in India before getting this assignment. No, really. He was a complete stranger to the land, its people, and its deeply intertwined cultures. And yet, he was given an absolutely impossible window. Just 5 weeks. 5 weeks to carve up entire provinces, historic cities, and centuries-old individual villages between the two new countries.
The line he ultimately drew, the Radcliffe Line, it completely shattered the subcontinent. It separated families and tore apart communities that had lived peacefully side by side for generations. An estimated 14 to 20 million people ended up crossing those newly drawn borders. Muslims moving desperately toward Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs moving toward India. It instantly became one of the largest mass migrations in human history, defined by just unimaginable chaos and uncertainty.
And the violence that erupted was absolutely devastating. Historians estimate that anywhere from several 100,000 to up to 2 million people lost their lives during this period. It is a massive, incredibly heavy death toll that stands as a stark reminder of the immense violence and human cost triggered by those new borders.
Moving to Section 4, Hope Amidst Tragedy and the First Days of a New Nation.
Now, amidst all that heartbreak and immense human tragedy, August 14th also stood as a moment of extraordinary hope and monumental achievement. Over in Karachi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was sworn in as the first Governor General of this newly minted nation. And why does this specific achievement matter so much historically? Well, because a country that had existed only as an idea, a demand, and a dream just a few years prior was now a reality. For the very first time in centuries, a self-governing Muslim state had been established, not through conquest and not through war, but through a democratic political movement. Historians today still look at this as a truly unique achievement in the history of nation building. But okay, let's dive into this list of early hurdles, because the reality of day one was incredibly daunting. Pakistan literally had to be built from scratch. They had to build a brand new government, establish an entire economy, create administrative frameworks, and develop basic infrastructure. And they had to do all of this while actively managing an enormous humanitarian crisis and resettling millions of traumatized refugees arriving across the new border. And just as the nation was taking its very first, incredibly difficult steps, they faced an enormous loss. In September of 1948, barely a year after independence, the nation's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, passed away. He lived just long enough to see his lifelong vision become a reality, but sadly not long enough to guide the country through its critical early growth.
Finally, Section 5, An Enduring Legacy, looking back over 75 years later.
Every August 14th is marked with flags and festivities, sure. But for the millions of families who actually lived through it, or who heard those harrowing stories firsthand from their parents and grandparents, the day carries a deep, deep weight of generational resilience and unbelievable sacrifice. The story of August 14th, 1947 is in many ways the story of the 20th century itself, empires ending, nations being born, and an extraordinary human cost. Today, the echoes of that single stroke of midnight continue to directly shape the lives and geopolitics of well over 1.5 billion people living across South Asia. It's a sheer testament to the weight of self-determination, and it leaves us with a final question to reflect on. How does the enduring power of a single idea continue to shape the destiny of over 1 billion people today? It is absolutely incredible to think that a group of people united solely by a shared belief managed to carve out their own destiny against such overwhelming odds. If you enjoyed diving into this complex history with us, be sure to subscribe for more historical explainers. There are so many more powerful stories from our shared history just waiting to be told. Thanks for learning with me today.